Just heard there is a recording, so if you don't want your name or your picture on it, you should hide your video or change your name if you want. We're not going to be, well, actually we might post it, so yeah. Hello, welcome. I'm Michelle de Lima. I work for the trustees in our Boston Community Gardens. Really excited to be partnering with the Boston Area Beekeepers Association to bring Nick Dorian, who is a native bee expert and is going to give us a glimpse into their lives. I want to tell you a couple of quick things. We have a lot of free online and some in-person with online option workshops coming up this summer and spring. We have a workshop on keeping backyard chickens coming up next week. And we have a follow-up to this, which is a more hands-on demo that Bill Perkins is going to lead about how to build your own mason bee house and where to put it and how to support these awesome pollinators. So I'll put the links to all of our workshops and to that specific mason bee one in the chat so that you can all grab them and take a look. That the mason bee house workshop is 10 o'clock on Saturday. So I think that's it for me. You want to say hello, Bill?
Great. Thanks, Michelle. And the Boston Area Beekeepers Association is also very pleased to be co-hosting this with you. And welcome to Nick. I've worked with Nick on a couple of other lectures that he presented before, and it's astounding. I'm always very excited when I hear Nick talk. So you're in for a ride tonight. I always tell people that I'm, as a beekeeper, I feel a little selfish because the honeybees are not native. They're naturalized for the most part, but they're not native to the United States. But it's really the native bees, the 100 or so species here in Massachusetts and many hundreds across the country that we really need to be concerned about. And if ever there was well, when you think about the phrase "save the bee," it's really the native bees that we should be paying more attention to. And Nick will probably tell you more about why. Nick Dorian is an ecologist, an educator, and a naturalist. He is a PhD student at Tufts University, where he studies the population ecology of wild bees, and he runs the Pollinator Institute, which I'm hoping he'll tell you more about later. He can be reached at nicholas.dorian@tufts.edu or on Twitter at @bee_searcher. And if you need any of that information again, I can send it to you in an email. Just contact the Boston Area Beekeeping Association, Boston's largest group of beekeepers, and I can send you that information. So with that, Nick, thank you for coming.
Thanks, Bill. This is great. I think it's my 4th year working with you, 4th or 5th time giving a talk with Bill. And I'm just so glad we were able to partner with the trustees this time to reach a broader audience. And today I'm going to talk to you guys all about bees. Now, if you think about bees, oftentimes we think of honeybees. These are, they form this beautiful hexagonal combs. There's colonies led by a queen with her subservient workers. They sting, they make honey. And in fact, we've had, humans have had a long, millennia-long relationship with honeybees, going back to the Egyptians, when we would cultivate them to collect honey and pollinate our crops, all the way till today, where we have beekeepers, both professional and hobbyist, managing bees for enjoyment and pollination of our crops. And in recent years, there's been a very popular conservation slogan, "Save the bees." And people have taken to the streets and really embraced the Save the Bees movement, and for good reason, right? If honeybees and bees were to disappear, a lot of the food that we depend on for nutrition, not necessarily carbohydrates, but vitamins and minerals, all the fruits that we like, many of them would not be available in grocery stores anymore. And not only that, but 90% of plants require animal pollination. So these are sunflowers and echinacea, coneflowers, and blueberries and pumpkins and coffee. Our wild plants and our agricultural crops require pollination from animals, some of which are honeybees, but other animals, many are insects like bees and butterflies and wasps and flies. And so in light of staggering decline of insects around the world, news headlines that stoke fear, plummeting insect numbers, insect apocalypse, ecological Armageddon, we have right to be concerned. If we lose our pollination services, our food security and the food systems that we've developed will change forever. And the threats that insect populations and particularly pollinators are facing are many. We have habitat loss, we have invasive species, we have light pollution and chemical pollution, we have climate change, we have increasing intensity and severity of droughts. We have agriculture and lawns. Lawns are a big issue. We don't have time to get into it really today, but just take my word that lawns are a huge problem for our native insects, and pesticides. And so all these factors, it might be reasonable to suspect that they threaten honeybees as much as other pollinators. But the problem is that honeybees are a managed insect. They're more of an agricultural commodity than they are in ecological or conservation issue. And in fact, we have more hives now than we did 50 years ago of honeybees. And so honeybees are not an endangered insect. They're not threatened with extinction. I think I liken the conservation of honeybees to the conservation of chickens. We need chickens for eggs, and we need honeybees for pollination, but they're not an ecological player the way that many other bees are. And the other bees that I'm talking about, the ones that are threatened by habitat loss and light pollution and climate change, the ones that are experiencing rapid environmental change faster and more unpredictable than they've ever experienced before, are native bees. There's 4,000 different kinds of bees native to North America. They've been here for millions of years. The honeybee came over with colonists and invaded the country. We have 4,000 species of bees that come in all shapes, sizes, colors. We have red bees and blue bees and green bees, bees that are called fairy bees because they're the size of a grain of rice, bees that are the size of a quarter. And these bees, in fact, do the lion's share, actually the bees' share, we'll say, of pollination of our crops in many places and most of our wild plants. So all those crops, those blueberries, those apples, yes, we bring honeybees to the farm, but in almost every case in which scientists have looked at the contribution of native bees versus honeybees, we need native bees to make a successful food system. The more different kinds of native bees we have visiting crops, the bigger, the more reliable, and in some cases, the tastier the food that's produced. And so this is what the talk's going to be about today. We're going to talk about all these different kinds of native bees and what we need to know about them in order to conserve them. And I think in order to address this question, we have to take a step back. And I'm going to pose the question, what is a bee? I just want you to take like 5-10 seconds just to get an idea in your head. If you had to define a bee, and I'm going to define it in 3 words for you. But if you had to define a bee, how would you define it? I'll just take a few seconds to let you think. So my definition of what is a bee is a vegetarian wasp. And to understand why this is the best definition I can give you, we have to go back 130 million years to the Cretaceous period, at a time when flowering plants were new on the scene. They were in vogue. Before then, flowering plants didn't really exist. Plants reproduced differently. They didn't reproduce through flowers. And so 130 million years ago, we had an environment where flowers were primitive and they were new. And we had wasps that bees did not exist because flowers weren't around. So wasps visited some of these early flowers, and these wasps are carnivorous, and they were seeking insects known as thrips. Now, thrips eat flower petals, they eat flower parts, and wasps eat those thrips, and they collect them for their offspring, and it's their source of protein. But as flowering plants became more of a thing, those thrips became dusted in pollen, and pollen is an additional source of protein, and it also doesn't move, whereas thrips move. And so you could imagine a scenario where you had wasps hunting thrips, and that could move, to wasps that are only collecting pollen, because pollen is very protein rich and it's stationary. And this is the leading hypothesis that's taken scientists quite a while to figure out, but it's the hypothesis of how bees evolved from wasps. And so now flowering plants are becoming more and more abundant on the planet. We have many different types. They're colonizing mountain slopes, they're colonizing oases and deserts, they're colonizing tropical forests. And from this diversity of flowers, we now have bees, wasps that are becoming bees that are specializing on these different kinds of flowers. And so from 20 species of wasps, there's just 20 species of wasps that hunted thrips, we radiated into 20,000 different kinds of bees, all that have unique relationships with the flowering plants across this world. And now one adaptation that bees have that makes them different from wasps, which is why bees aren't wasps, but one reason is that they have these branched hairs. Now you can imagine pollen is a very tiny particle, and it's statically charged. So just like a balloon sticks to your head when you rub it against your hair, bees are very hairy, and part of that reason is to collect pollen. And in addition, these hairs are branched, and so there's just more surface area to carry that pollen. But it's not always easy to tell what a bee is. I've just told you that this is a bee, but is this a bee? This is often an insect that we see flying around our picnics, but this is actually a yellow-jacket wasp. They're not very hairy, and their wings are folded. And if you see them at a picnic, it's definitely not a bee, because bees aren't interested in human food. Bees are interested in flowers. Wasps, on the other hand, many of them are carnivorous, and these non-native wasps are interested in our food. But other times we have insects that look like this. This is a fly, a hoverfly that has two big bulbous eyes and on its head, and these short club-like antennae. In comparison, bees have longer antennae and not big bulbous eyes. And then we have cases like this, where this is a bee that maybe doesn't look like a bee to you, because it's not black and white, there's no stripes. But one thing this bee does have is it's covered in pollen. And if you notice these legs, they call this the chap-legged bee, because it has these big bushy legs, and these legs are used to carry pollen. And another feature of our native bees is that they don't all live in hives. They actually live in many different kinds of societies. So we often think of bees as highly social, and maybe that's why we like honeybees, because they resemble human societies. They're very organized and efficient. But bee living actually exists on a spectrum from very highly social all the way down to solitary, where every female builds a nest for her own. And in fact, most of our native bees, about 90% of them, are solitary. So honeybees are the exception. Honeybees and bumblebees that live in colonies, they don't live like other bees do, than most bees. And the solitary bees are as important for crop pollination as these social bees. But we don't know very much about them, because perhaps they're just not as well studied. And so these are the secret lives of bees that I want to dive into today. These are the mysteries, so many mysteries about how solitary bees live, whereas we actually have a pretty good sense about how honeybees live. And I'm going to paraphrase The Little Prince by saying, it is such a mysterious place, the land of bees. If Antoine de Saint-Exupéry was an entomologist, he might have made this statement. Unfortunately, he didn't, but I'm going to paraphrase and say that he did. Because it really is a mysterious place. What do these bees do throughout their lives? And today I'm going to give you an overview of what we do know bees do, but also recognize that the bees I'm showing you are sort of cherry-picked examples of cases where we have studied them fairly well, acknowledging that there's many hundreds of bees that you would find on your flowers in your backyard, which scientists have no knowledge of what they do. So what do our native bees do? I'm going to break it down into three parts. They build nests, they visit flowers, and they hibernate. And that's basically the life cycle of a bee, is that there's some part of the life cycle that's involved with building a nest where offspring are provisioned. There's, at the same time, they're also visiting flowers and collecting resources to feed those offspring. And then the rest of that life cycle is spent underground or in a nest, developing and hibernating. And so we're going to focus on building these nests first. And so the bees, I actually study a ground nesting bee for my PhD, and I'm going to use them as a great example because I've actually spent the last 4 years digging into what these bees do. And it's the kind of science and natural history work that I find so fascinating and valuable. So these bees have one generation per year. It's not always the case in bees, but these bees have one generation per year. In spring, the males and the females, they emerge. In summer, the larvae are developing in the nests that those females made. In the fall, those larvae are turning into adults. They're pupating. Just like a caterpillar spins a chrysalis into a butterfly, a bee develops the same way, and a bee spins a cocoon and turns into an adult by the fall. They hibernate underground in the nest, and the cycle repeats itself 1 year later in spring with the bees emerging. Let's dive into what's actually happening here. So the males in spring emerge first, and it's sort of a race to be first because females are the ones that females are not mate limited, right? Males are mate limited. There's few females, there's many males, and so it's best to be on the scene first. And these males, they come out and they sort of pounce on the females, and they form these mating balls. And you can see this early spring in sort of sandy areas, and the males are tussling around, and only one male emerges victorious. Now, females only mate one, maybe twice in their life, and so many males go unmated and they lose their opportunity. And so it's really imperative that these bees are first. But you also know that it's spring, and even though we had a gorgeous week this past week, it could snow next week. And so you don't want to be too early, right? So there's a little bit of timing that's involved with when you come out. But if you come out and there is no more frost and you survive, the males and the females, the first thing they do, in addition to mating, is refueling on these early spring blooms. So they've just spent 7 months underground coping with no food. There's no food that they're eating underground. And so they are thirsty and hungry. And they come out and look for blooms. And maple blooms are really important for them, and willow flowers, like pussy willow is really good. And they're looking for nectar, which is sugar, to replenish their fat reserves. After mating and after replenishing, that's about a 2-week period, the males get out of the picture. Males really don't help with much care in bee society, actually any care in bee society. And the females are responsible for building nests. So the females find a suitable site, in this case, a nice sandy slope, and she digs a tunnel down into the sand, maybe 10, 12 inches. And off of that tunnel, she'll build these lateral chutes. They're called offshoots. And these offshoots, each at the end of them contains one offspring. And at the end, she'll make a little chamber. She'll fashion it out of saliva and a secretion from her abdomen. It's sort of a waterproof lining. Bees are very susceptible to humidity. And so these waterproof lining is a real nice protective coat. She might make 5 or 6 of these chambers in a nest, and it'll take her most of her life to do so. That takes about a day to make a chamber and lay an egg inside. And this is what a chamber looks like. So it looks sort of like a jelly bean. I guess bees invented the first jelly beans. And inside every chamber is one bee offspring. It's an egg that she's laid. And she gives that egg protein and sugar. Protein is pollen, and sugar is nectar. And there's also a lot of microbes in this provision, which is why I call it sourdough. And so microbes, we don't have time to get into that today, but microbes are really important for bee health. And it's I guess it's narrow to say that bees only need flowers. Bees need flowers, but also microbes. Just like we need microbes for a healthy gut, bees need microbes to develop properly. And this provision, it sort of ferments in a way that makes it more palatable and digestible for the bees. And studies suggest that without microbes, bees aren't able to develop on just pollen and nectar. And these brood cells also provide protection from pathogens and nasty microbes that might harm them. So one female is building a nest, and in many of these bees, they build nests in close proximity. These are called aggregations. And so you can see here on this cemetery slope, every little sort of light-colored patch of sand is a nest. And so this one sort of bare slope may contain anywhere from 50 to 200 nests, depending on when you visit throughout the season. And one reason they do this, one reason you might want to nest together, is because nesting underground is fraught with danger. There are beetles and other predators that are seeking, that want to get their eggs inside those bee nests, right? this is a stationary life cycle. There is a chamber of protein and sugar underground. If I were a beetle, I'd want to go and steal some of that. And so the beetles, in this case, this is a blister beetle. These beetles wander along the ground and try to sneak their eggs into the nests of these host bees. And there's a very complicated way in which they go about doing this, but I'll just say that they're very successful in getting their eggs into those bees' nests. And in some cases, it can account up to 25% of brood cells contain a beetle parasite. And so bees, even though they can sting, these beetles are not threatened by the bees' stingers, and so they're not interested in eating the adult bees. They're interested in getting their offspring in to eat the young bees. And so there might be some ways that bees can avoid. It might be good to avoid getting predated by these beetles, because these beetles could cost you a lot of your offspring reproductive potential. And one way that bees have done this is to totally change how they live. Now, this is a different bee. The cellophane bees haven't figured out how to avoid predation. But these sweat bees, these striped sweat bees, Agapostum, they're actually quite common in backyards and on flowers all throughout the city. And this is the bicolored sweat bee. It has a nice black and white abdomen. And these bees don't live solitarily. They actually live communally. And so many females live inside a single hole with one entrance, but each female builds her own nest. So it's sort of like an apartment building with a doorman. And that's exactly what they have. They have a door woman, we'll say. And so you can sort of see here how there's a female bee coming back. She's got pollen laden on her legs, but there's another green head in the entrance. And this green head is the guard bee. And so they take turns guarding the nest. And studies have demonstrated that having the presence of these guards actually deters beetles and other parasites from being able to sneak their eggs into those nests. And so bees this is why when I say they live on a continuum, they don't live solitarily, they live one step up communally, and this communal living has its advantages. I could talk all day about ground nesting bees because they account for 70% of our known bee diversity. But I do want to move on to another type of ground nesting, another type of bee. And these are the above ground nesting bees, the renters, the excavators, and the architects. Now, renters are looking for unoccupied cavities that already exist. They don't want to be bothered with digging out their own nest site. The excavators, they do the busy work of digging out and making their own cavity. And then architects actually don't even look for an existing cavity, and they cement pebbles together with plant resins and saps. And we're going to talk about the renters and the excavators most in detail. One of the most common and well-known renter is the mason bee, also known as the orchard bee. Now, the mason bee is a really important pollinator of spring orchard crops, such as apples and cherries. And it has a very similar life cycle to the cellophane bee, in that it's an annual life cycle. And so in spring, at position number 1 here on the life cycle slide, the males and the females emerge. The males and the females mate. You get the picture. The males get out of the way, and the females commence nesting. They come out a little bit later than the cellophane bee, so they're not using maples and willows, but they're using black cherry trees and crabapple trees. And instead of nesting underground, they find a suitable vacant cavity, such as an old beetle burrow in a tree, or perhaps a bamboo rod or a cardboard tube that a friendly homeowner has left out for them. And these are the bees that you might support with bee hotels, if you've heard of that fad. And what Bill will be talking about at the workshop this coming weekend. And they don't lay eggs sort of on offshoots off of this tunnel. They lay them in a linear fashion. And so you can see at stage 4 how we have the white egg, and it's on this sort of yellow mass of pollen. And then we have a division, and this division is made of mud, hence the name mason bees. And then we have another offspring, and it's sort of white egg with a mass of pollen, and another mud division, and then another white egg and a mass of pollen. And this happens maybe 3 times in the nest, sometimes 7 or 8 times in the nest. And then she seals it up, and the female dies, and she leaves the cells to develop and eat all those food throughout the summer. And then the cycle repeats itself. And so again, this is a single generation per year, and many bees have this sort of single generation. Now, orchard growers, orchard farmers have recognized the value of these bees because these bees have a particular affinity for orchard crops, such as apples and cherries and pears. And they compared the ability of these bees with honeybees. So I'm going to show you some data right here from 5 to 6 years with honeybees. And you can see the weather on the left. Now we have sunny conditions for the first 5 years, and the honeybees produced anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 pounds of cherries. But it rained in 1997, and all of you that are beekeepers know that honeybees they don't really like foul or inclement weather. They're more of a fair weather forager. And so when it rained in 1997 all the time, the honeybees didn't go out, and the farmer didn't get any harvest. But this is unacceptable if you're a grower because you need to make a profit. And so the farmer turned to these mason bees. These are native bees that are more adapted to the local climate, and they don't mind foraging in inclement weather. And not only that, but they're highly efficient because they're only attracted to these orchard flowers. And so they don't get distracted by dandelions. They don't get distracted by maples. Their sole goal is to go for these orchard crops because it's the food that their offspring develops best on. And so these mason bees were able to churn out 9,000 to 38,000, almost 38,000 pounds of cherries, and 9,000 pounds occurred in a rainy year. And so clearly these bees are highly efficient and an essential component of food systems. And just to give you an estimate, they're so much more efficient than honeybees at about 250 Osmia lignaria, which are these mason bees, can do the same work as about a single hive of honeybees or about 20,000 bees. And there's all sorts of reasons why this is the case, but it has to do with behavior and their constancy and their affinity for these particular flowers. Other bees, such as these leafcutter bees, don't line their nests with mud. Instead, they line their nests with leaves, hence their name. And so this is a picture of a leafcutter bee that's actually sawing off a half disc of a leaf, and then she sort of stuffs it in her nest, and she seals it off. So the whole nest is inside of a stem, but it's made of leaves instead of mud. So the mason bee will cap with mud, and the leafcutter will cap with leaves. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, here we have 3 different kinds of bees that all collect different resources. These are all renters, and they all furnish their apartments with different kinds of materials. So Megachile, the leafcutter bees, furnish it with leaves. Hyraeades, the resin bees, they furnish it with sap and resin from trees. And then Osmia, the mason bees, they furnish it with mud. Now, one of my favorite examples of a bee sort of decorating their nest the way they want are the bees that use petals. These are petal bees. So these are bees that actually go out and collect flower petals. And so instead of lining their cells with leaves, they're actually lining it with petals. And there might be all sorts of reasons. One of the most intriguing might be that petals have certain antimicrobial properties. And so they use certain types of petals to deter pathogenic fungi and harmful bacteria from infecting their offspring. Other bees don't rely on the outside plants for resources. Instead, they make their own furnishings. And these are masked bees. They're closely related to the cellophane bees that make those sort of waterproof chambers. And these masked bees, you can sort of see in this image here, they've lined their nests with these sort of cellophane linings. And every little grub, that's a baby bee. I'm sorry, it's not cuter, but that's the nature of it. It's not just a tiny adult bee, but bees look much smaller and a little bit less cute than the adult bees. But these cavities, right? We mentioned that these underground nests were exposed to predators and vulnerable. But these cavities are also vulnerable to predators because they're stationary. And one of my favorite predators to talk about are these wasps. They're called chalcid wasps, the chalcidoid wasps. And they actually, they sit on the outside of the nest, and they have this really long ovipositor, this really long egg-laying organ on the tip of their abdomen that's able to feel around and drill into the nest. And I have a video to show you what this looks like, but it's quite astounding. So what you're going to see here is we have a bee's nest. This is a masked bee's nest, and we have four cells. So here's a cell, the back, the earliest provision cell, then we have the next most, and there's 4 cells. And each cell contains pollen and nectar. That's what this sort of beige color is. And there should be an egg inside every cell. Now at the front, we have a wasp. This is a parasitic wasp, just like the Chalcid wasp that I mentioned. And here is its ovipositor. Here is its long ovipositor that's going in. And I just want you to watch this, because you'll see it lay an egg, which is a phenomenal video. Ichneumon, they love to know. So look at the tip right here. An egg will come out very shortly. Look at that. Oh my gosh, the egg just came out. And it bypassed the first cell. Like, that's amazing, right? Look how long. It's more than the length of the body of the insect, and it's able to go past this first cell that doesn't have an egg in it yet because the female bee is still making it, and she's able to lay it in the cell, and the host bee will never know this happened because she's already gone on to the next cell. What an ingenious life cycle that this is. And it just blows my mind that there's all sorts of insects that also depend on bees, right? Those beetles couldn't have lived without the bees. This wasp couldn't live without the bees. And so when we think about ecosystems, we have to think about all the players that bees depend on, the flowers, but then also the other players that depend on bees, such as these wasps, and they're all valuable. There are other bees that rent, but they rent in perhaps unconventional places. They're not in the nice high rises with the nice vacant tubes. These are green, race car green sweat bees, but they nest instead in moist, rotting logs. So these are fallen logs in the woods, and this might not seem like a place where a bee would nest, but it totally is. And this is, I show you this example to illustrate that so many different kinds of places can be habitat for our native bees, and that fallen logs not support native bees just as much as a bee hotel that you might hang in your house. So there's all sorts of things that we need to know about our native bees, and the more we know, the more we understand that we need diverse landscapes and heterogeneous landscapes to support as many bees as possible. Now, the cool thing about Algichlora is that it's not a single generation per year. It actually produces 2, sometimes 3 generations per year. And so I just want to give you an example of a life cycle that deviates from the one that I've already established. So in spring, females already mated. They were mated in the fall. These mated females emerge. There's no males yet. And the first generation begins making their eggs. So this first female, she will produce these brood cells and keep them in this moist, rotting log. And then in early summer, that generation that she laid will emerge. And now this generation consists of both males and females. The males and females mate. The males get out of the picture. The original female is out of the picture. She's died. And this first generation of this progeny female that's been mated, she commences to build another nest in another log. And that generation develops, and that generation emerges. And so these green bees, while you might see them throughout the year, we've now seen there's multiple generations at play. And in order for these bees to persist from one year to the next, both of these generations need to be successful, and they need to successfully survive the winter and emerge the following spring. And so just to give you a sense of how these bees need flowers and nesting sites throughout the year. Giving them just in spring or just in fall won't suffice because their life cycle takes place from May all the way through October. And again, these bees are very common. You can find them on flowers if you live anywhere near a wooded area. These race car green bees that are all green are very common on all sorts of flowers. The last example of a renter that I want to talk to you about are these, or I guess not renter, above ground nesting bees. These Carpenter bees. They're actually excavators. And so you probably know the large Carpenter bee, Xylocopa, this enormous bumblebee-looking bee, and it nests in your deck. I hate to say it, but it's the only bee that nests in your deck. And one really great way of getting around it is sort of, if you notice where they're coming out of, you can use caulk, or you can paint over it or stuff it with steel wool. Just avoid pesticides so that those pesticides don't linger in the environment. But I want to talk to you about a different kind of Carpenter bee today, which are the small Carpenter bees, the Seratina. And these Seratina have a really intriguing life cycle, one that depends on raspberry stems and sumac stems to reproduce. And so these females, they excavate the pith. So raspberry stems are not hollow, that a renter might need, but they're full of sort of soft wood. And that's where they get their name Carpenter bees. So these bees actually chew up the wood and they break it into sort of a pulp, and that's what they use to line their nests. So you see in this bottom panel on C, where these partitions are not wood, they're not sap, they're not leaves, they're not petals, it's wood. And so here in each cell, we have a developing female carpenter bee. But it doesn't end there, because these bees emerge as adults, and they need to be fed, the offspring need to be fed before winter approaches. And in order to do this, the female bee actually creates a helper. She creates a daughter, a Cinderella daughter, that doesn't survive the winter. And this daughter female is exclusively responsible for foraging and collecting resources to feed her siblings. These siblings that will survive and go on to have nests of their own is taken care of by a sibling that will never have that opportunity. And so it's a really interesting life cycle that this female intentionally creates, this nesting female. She creates an intentionally small bee, and that bee is now subservient and has to go forage on her own for her siblings. And so this is a case where you can start to see how we're not solitary or not communal. All of a sudden, we have a division of labor where there's egg-laying individuals and non-egg-laying individuals. And so you can start to see how within the common bees, we have solitary lifestyles, we have communal lifestyles, and now we have sort of sub-social life cycles and lifestyles. In the case of the Cinderella bee, it's just it's so fascinating to me that a female would be able to create a helper and then that helper would totally be able to raise her siblings, and does so sort of without question, right? So that's what I have to tell you about nesting. The next part, I want to tell you all about the flowers and why our native bees visit flowers. So nests are stationary, right? They're fixed in place, whether they're underground or above ground. But bees need resources. Adults need resources for themselves, and they need pollen and nectar for their offspring. And so bees must fly to find these flowers. And so they collect nectar, they collect pollen, and sometimes they collect oils, which are really fatty and often antimicrobial. Now, what kind of flowers do bees prefer? They typically prefer whites, blues, and yellows. So bees have a different sort of eye sensitivity, and they can see different color spectrum than humans can. So humans see, in blues and in reds and in greens, and bees don't see very well in the red part of the spectrum. So it sort of bees' vision sort of drops off on this part of the spectrum, and instead they can see ultraviolet colors. And so what a flower looks like to us is not necessarily what it looks like to a bee, but in general, red flowers aren't the best at attracting bees. And so when bees are flying around, they're going to be most attracted to bright yellow beacons like sunflowers, or blue flowers, such as like lobelias, or white flowers like water lilies in the middle of a pond. And bees aren't really picky when they're going for flowers for nectar. Sugar and nectar is loaded with sugar. Sometimes it's up to 70% sugar, and bees really go for the flowers that are loaded with nectars. In this case, the mints. If you ever go in a garden, you grow flowering mint or oregano or basil, it's always just loaded with bees because mints are really prodigious producers of nectar. And even sometimes these flowers produce so much nectar that bees get a little frustrated with the flowers because the flowers are narrow tubes and the bees are big, like this Carpenter bee here on the right. And so the bees resort to other techniques, and they slice a slit in the back of the flower and they stick their tongue in, and they get nectar in the way the flower doesn't want them to get nectar. But the flower can't move, the flower can't kick the bee off, and so the bee gets a nectar meal. And if you ever you look at hostas in the summer, hostas have a similar feature. When they flower, they're kind of purple spire. Bees will often sort of slit the base of the flowers, and you can sort of see bees doing this pretty easily. And so, yeah, so bees will visit basically any flower. They're not too picky when it comes to nectar. But pollen is protein rich. And you could imagine that certain bees develop on low protein pollen, certain bees develop on high protein pollen. And pollen also has a lot of nasty chemicals because pollen is what plants need to reproduce. And so they don't care if the nectar gets eaten, but if the pollen gets eaten, well, that's a potential plant that is not getting made. And so plants resort to all sorts of ways to defend their pollen, and bees have all sorts of ways of digesting and dealing with that toxic pollen. And so when bees find a type of pollen they like, they typically stick to it. And this This holds for bees that visit many different kinds of flowers and would get sunflower pollen and bee balm pollen and pollen from oaks. But it also applies to bees that only go for sunflower pollen or only go for willow pollen. And these bees that are very particular about their tastes, and if you look across a large geographic area, all individuals of particular species will visit just that one group of plants. These are known as specialist bees. And these specialist bees are active only for a short period of time, right? 3 to 4 weeks out of the year, they're visiting flowers. And so it depends on what's flowering. And so a spring generalist that visits lots of different things might visit dandelions and oaks and wild plums, but a spring specialist will stick just to blueberries or just to willows. And in fall too, this is very popular among fall bees to stick just to asters, the goldenrods and the asters. And there are many, about 30 species in New England that specialize exclusively on goldenrods and asters. And so if you're going to plant one thing to support bees, it would be a goldenrod or aster. You get the most bang for your buck. Because there's so many specialist bees that depend on these flowers. Now, there's some other cool specialists that I want to draw your attention to. One of them is known as the hibiscus bee. Now, if you've ever been to the salt marsh, especially in the mid-Atlantic in late summer, these beautiful purple and pink and white hibiscus flowers are cloaking the marsh edge. And there's a bee, this Tilothrix bombiformis, the hibiscus bee, is probably there too. It's a specialist exclusively on hibiscus flowers. And this bee has all sorts of adaptations for collecting the big, sticky, chemically defended grains of hibiscus flowers. But it also has a really interesting life cycle in that it needs a fresh water source nearby to complete its nest. And these bees, they walk on water. I'll just say it very simply. They sort of skate along freshwater ponds and puddles, and they actually lap up water. And water is as important to the success of their life cycle as hibiscus is. And so without clean sources of water, these bees wouldn't be able to build their turret nests. They're also called turret bees. And they lap up this water, they return to the nest, and they moisten the soil to make it easier to excavate. And so just a case where we look at flowers like, wow, all this bee needs is a hibiscus, it's a specialist, but it actually needs more than that. It needs a clean water source and it needs a place to nest. And so I share this just to get you thinking about, yes, these specialist bees are amazing, but also think about how does their specialization on flowers fit in with the rest of their life cycle. And another species that is a specialist on a garden plant that you might grow with these broad-footed cellophane bees. So another kind of cellophane bee that's active in summer. This bee specializes on tomatillo flowers, wild tomatillos and cultivated tomatillos. And tomatillos have an interesting requirement in order to access the resources. So tomatillos don't produce very much nectar. They produce a lot of pollen, and the pollen is locked up in pores. Now these pores need to be they need to be vibrated at a certain frequency in order to let the pollen out. And some of these pollinators, some of these bees, including cellophane bees, these broad-footed cellophane bees, they know the secret code. They know how to unlock the pollen, and all they have to do is vibrate the flower. And this is a case of a bumblebee doing this, but a cellophane bee does it just the same. And you can see this on this video, how the pollen is sort of snowing out of the tip of these anthers on the flower. And this bee becomes dusted in the pollen, and then it's able to groom it into these pollen baskets on its leg. And not only tomatillos, but eggplants and potatoes and peppers and tomatoes all require buzz pollination to set fruit, and even more cranberries and blueberries. There's many different crops that require this. Native bees, like the cellophane bee or bumblebees, can do this. Honeybees cannot. And so another case where we need specialist pollinators that know these behaviors, know these tricks to our native plants in order to have a successful food system, one that's filled with our nutritious diet. And my last example of a favorite specialist bee is the squash bee. Now, you guessed it, this bee is a favorite of tomatoes. No, I'm joking, it's squash. They love wild squash. And wild squash grows in Southwest United States and Northern Mexico. But humans have had a fondness for squash for many thousands of years. And as native peoples traded and cultivated wild squash into the domestic varieties that we know, like butternut squash or zucchinis or pumpkins, the squash followed that domestication route from the southwestern United States all the way up to New England and west out to Oregon most recently, and in parts of Canada. And so it's a really example of, this is a bee that lives in a desert, and all of a sudden it's able to be, it's adaptable enough that it can live in the harsh winters of New England. And this bee is not just it like squash. This bee is a rock star pollinator of squash, and it's responsible for most of the pollination of the $1.5 million industry that is pumpkin sales every year. And these bees, the reason they're so good is that they don't know the secret password to squash, but they get up early enough that they're able to access the squash flowers. So squash flowers have an interesting biology, and they open at dawn, but they close by noon. And so if you want to be a good pollinator of squash, you need to get up at dawn, and these squash bees do. And so here we have a graph where we go from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and by noon, the squash flowers are wilted. At dawn, they're this nice, brilliant starburst. We have squash bees, and then we have other bees like honeybees and bumblebees. Now the squash bees get up around 6 a.m., the honeybees get up around 10 a.m. By 10 a.m., honeybees have missed the boat. The squash bees have done 96% of the pollination by the time honeybees arrive on farms. And so this is a case example where the specialist bee, the early bee, gets the pollen, and the squash bees have made a whole lifestyle around getting up really early. And so we've talked about how bees can time their life cycles and have variation across the year, where they can have 1 or 2 generations. And here's a case where individual bees can get up really early, or they can be active. Some bees are active later in the day. And bees have made a living out of collecting pollen and timing their life cycles to be the most efficient at collecting pollen from flowers. But not all bees collect pollen. Some bees are known as cuckoo bees. And these are bees that, just like cowbirds, that sneak their eggs into the nests of other birds, these cuckoo bees, they don't collect pollen, and they freeload off of the nests of other bees. And so these bees are devious, and they are able to sneak into the nest, cloaked under chemical pheromones that they're able to produce, and lay eggs inside the nest undetected. And here's an example of a video. This is a squash bee nest that's being raided and parasitized by a Triapeolus cuckoo bee. Let's see if you can. You'll see the nest hole that's sort of very nondescript. It's a ground nesting bee. And out comes not a squash bee, but a cuckoo bee. And that cuckoo bee has just laid at least 1 egg inside of the nest, making sure that it wasn't detected, and now it's gone. And so that squash bee will return and likely not realize that its nest has been parasitized. It'll seal up the brood cell with its host bee inside and a cuckoo bee larva inside. And I told you how these host bees, these bee larvae, are sort of grub-like. They're not super special. Well, look at this cuckoo bee larva. Look at the mandibles on this thing. This thing is made to kill. And these cuckoo bee larvae are vicious. They go into those nests and they kill the host bee really quickly, and then they develop on the pollen preserves. And only parasitic bees have these outrageous morphologies and mandibles because they need it to complete their life cycle. They need to kill the host bee in order to have unbridled access to the pollen and nectar. You might say this is a terrible life cycle for the host bee, but sometimes karma comes back to bite the cuckoo bees in the butt. And here's an example of a Triapeolus, this cuckoo bee, but it's being eaten by a crab spider. And my friend and colleague Max McCarthy, he took this great photo of a cuckoo bee being eaten by a crab spider. And look at the crab spider. It's the same color as the sunflower. So this cuckoo bee likely had no idea what was coming for it. But I show this to also let you know that flowers can be fraught with danger. There are parasites and predators at the nest, but adult bees also have to cope with a whole host of predators on flowers, not just spiders, but other wasps. And bee wolf wasps are a little bit less patient than the crab spiders that sit and wait in camouflage. These bee wolves, they dart after the bees that are flying or resting on flower. They grab them with their arms and they sting them. And I was lucky enough to see this in action just in the middle of the city on a Black-Eyed Susan last year. Here we have the bee. This is the bee wolf. Its stinger is stinging. Oh, sorry. It's stinging this other darn it, it's stinging this sweat bee. And so this sweat bee is covered in pollen. This bee wolf is sedating it, and it will actually bring this bee back to its nest. And the wasp offspring will develop on the bee. And so again, another case where bees are not only essential to the reproduction of plants, but bees are essential to the reproduction of wasps and other animals. And so that's my talk all about flowers. And the last part, the short part, is what do bees do? Well, bees also hibernate, and we need to consider this part where they're not active, where we don't see them. And it's really hard to think about this, right? How do you conserve something you can't see? How do you know? Well, by understanding the life cycles and how they live, we can infer what they need when we don't see them. And so this solitary bee life cycle that I showed you earlier, where they're nesting and foraging above ground and then developing under the nest, well, the bees that nest below ground, they need undisturbed habitat. We can't go through there with a tiller or a shovel and till up all this soil because there's bees resting under there. We need that, those bees need undisturbed areas to finish their development. Nesting habitat that for bees that nest above ground, well, they need undisturbed twigs. Those twigs need to stand for at least a year while the offspring develop inside. Now, this doesn't always work with how humans like to garden, but if you sort of partition part of your garden or leave some areas undisturbed, these above ground nesting bees that nest in twigs like this, just 6 to 10 inches tall, will thank you. And these bees are the leafcutter bees we talked about, the mason bees we talked about, the masked bees that make those clear cellophane linings, and also the Seratina, the Cinderella bees, right? They all use stems like this. Not understanding this and not providing nesting sites and not providing flowers and not providing undisturbed overwintering sites, it's a big reason why native bees are in decline. We have data from bumblebees, which I didn't talk about today very much in depth because it's a whole other I could talk for an hour about bumblebees alone. But we have bumblebees that are declining, and you might have heard of the endangered rusty-patched bumblebee, which was listed a few years ago as an endangered bee, but we actually don't know very much about its biology. And in fact, just this last year, the Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't able to create a reserve for this bee because we didn't know enough about where it nested. It wasn't that they didn't want to create a reserve, it's that we couldn't because we didn't know if they nested in grasslands or in forests. And this is the kind of idea where we need to know more about bees, these basic parts of their biology in order to conserve them. But I also show you this graph because I want to illustrate that. So what we have here is we have a graph where we have the abundance of bees. And if there's a blue circle, it means they've increased over the last 100 years. And if there's a red circle, they've decreased in abundance. So I also want to show you that bee declines are not just all bees are declining, but that there's winners and losers. And the rusty-patched bumblebee is a loser, but there's other bees such as Bombus impatiens, this top mark, that is a winner. And Bombus impatiens is one of our most common bumblebees in the city. And so keep that in mind, that humans have changed the landscape in ways that favor certain bees, the generalists, the ones that are weedy almost, they sort of like disturbance. And then humans have harmed the landscape for bees that are more specialized. And so if we're going to save native bees, if we're going to save native bees, I've come up with a little acronym to help you remember what to do. And I call it SEEDS. So we want to sustain diverse native landscapes, ones that contain flowers and resources and habitats that these native bees need. We need to take an entire life cycle approach. Let's consider all aspects, all life stages. We need to eliminate all pesticide use. And we need to make observations, whether that's you in your backyard or scientists like me. And then we need to share what we found. And we need to build a community of people interested in protecting bees. And so I just a little bit about sustaining native landscapes. Native landscapes, which are those made with native plants, those that originated here and have co-evolved and share a history with our native bees. These native landscapes support local food webs. They're attractive to both pollinators and insects, but also people. I find them very, aesthetically pleasing. They don't require very much water or fertilizer. So if you're thinking of gardening with native plants, they're actually a pretty good climate-forward solution. And they also reconnect us to our natural heritage. And I recommend 2 books for further reading on the topic. One by Douglas Tallamy, who sort of pioneered this movement, and Nature's Best Hope. And then one by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is all about how plants can be used to reconnect to our natural heritage, at least partly. And these are some of the habitats that I'm talking about when we want to create diverse native landscapes. We have early season forests that provide flowers like trout lily and spring beauty. We have open season meadows that have goldenrod and milkweed, but are also close to forests. So bees that need to nest in forests but use flowers in meadows can do so. We have meadows that are wetter and support sort of wetland loving plants, and bees that nest in wetter areas will make their homes in these stens and wetlands. And then we have sort of open wetlands with water lilies and pickerel weed, flowers that that produce lots of nectar because they're not water limited. And water lilies and pickerel weeds support lots of bees in late summer. And then we have places that are really drought stricken, like dunes, but dunes have plants that are adapted, and goldenrods and beach roses. These support a whole host of insects as well, and bees in particular. And we need all of these different types of landscapes. And many of these images are from trustees' properties, such as Crane Beach, or a place out on Martha's Vineyard where we have shrubby oceanfront scrubland. Scrubland is very different than mature forest, and it's very different than in meadows. And neither could replace the other. We have sandy power line cuts. These power line cuts, there might be an eyesore, but they're a state of the forest that's not mature, right? You have an open canopy and sort of sparse trees. And these sorts of environments support a whole type of native bee that doesn't like the dense forest and doesn't like the open meadow. They prefer having a sort of a Goldilocks amount of shade. But I also don't want to overlook that we have cities, and cities are a big part of Massachusetts and New England. And so providing habitat for bees in cities is also really important. And so my group, the Tufts Pollinator Initiative, we started this at Tufts University a few years ago. We create native gardens in cities for pollinators, and we document and we observe what insects are on these flowers. And you can see one of our graduate students, Maria, doing a survey here. And these gardens in cities, if you're thinking of creating a garden for pollinators, you have to keep in mind, you want it to be diverse. You want it to be diverse in color. You want it to be diverse in shape of flower and size of plant. You want it to be diverse, most importantly, in the bloom time, so that you have things blooming in May, in July, in August, and October. Much better to have 3 things that bloom in 3 different months than 3 things that bloom in the same month. And I offer a selection of plants that I find particularly attractive, and we've documented that bees and other pollinators really like. So we have showy goldenrod and foxglove beard tongue, wild bergamot known as bee balm, Joe pieweed, Culver's root, New England aster, coreopsis, ironweed, and the list goes on. And if you look at the QR code in the top right, you can actually scan that with your phone, and it'll take you to our website, where we have information on other flowers you can plant for bees. But just take a look at the diversity of shapes and colors and size. Some of them look like suns, some of them look like candelabras, others look like tubes that they have to crawl into. So the more different kinds of flowers you offer bees, the more different kinds of bees you'll support. The second component, and I know it's 7 o'clock, just bear with me, I only have a few more slides. The second part of seeds is taking an entire life cycle approach. So providing nesting sites and materials for bees, leaves and resins and mud, but also suitable nesting sites underground, flowers, pollen and nectar, we just talked about that, and then suitable overwintering habitat. And I want to just mention that bee hotels, which Bill will talk more about in his workshop, bee hotels are fun, right? You can put up it's basically a block or a building that bees can move into, and the building consists of a bunch of hollow tubes. These are all for renter bees, so the leafcutter bees and the mason bees. Now, you know that bee hotels won't support everything because we talked about ground nesting bees and bees that excavate stems, but this is a start, right? So you can support the mason bees and the leafcutter bees by putting up hollow stems about 5 to 6 inches long. But the most important thing is recognizing this is not a set it and forget it. Managing habitat for bees is an active, intentional process, and you have to make sure that you're able to clean the apartments for these bees. You need to make sure that you can remove the tubes at the end of every year so that pathogens don't build up. And Bill will talk more about this, but I'll just say that a lot of Home Depot, a lot of these stores are marketing bee hotels, insect hotels as the next fad. But you have to make sure that they're long enough, 5 to 6 inches at least, and that there's a way of removing the nesting materials in order for the bees to survive. The second E in seeds is eliminating pesticides. Anything that kills a mosquito kills a bee. It's simple as that. And if there's no pesticide, unless it's like an essential oil, there's no pesticide that can be marketed as doesn't kill a bee if it's also killing ticks and mosquitoes. And oftentimes these labelings are really devious and deceptive, and they're designed to make you not think about the ecological consequences. They're pervasive. And so if you can even just say, we're going to do 1 fewer grub treatment this year, or we're going to call the pesticide company and say, no, we don't want you to come. We really care about the health of our lawn and our ecosystem, but we don't want pesticides. Those are sort of actions that are really valuable to take. And then the last thing is D and S, which is do, observe, and share what you see. So practice often, engage your senses, get down to the level of the flower, level of bees. What does a bee see? And how can you sort of get in that mindset of, is my garden diverse enough? Can a bee find a flower in that garden? Notice which bees are interacting with each other. Are honeybees bullies? Are native bees bullies? Are they sharing the flowers? How do bees approach a butterfly? Do you see a bee wolf hunting a bee? And take photos. If you have everyone's got a camera now on their phone, just take photos. And there's a huge community of people on the internet, iNaturalist, and other sites like Bug Guide, where you can upload your photos, and experts from all around the globe, including myself, will identify the bees and the insects you see, and help you understand the nature around you. And I find that it builds this incredible sense of place when you start being able to give certain insects a name. Even just bumblebee, mason bee, sweat bee, all these names represent a diversity of lifestyles and needs for our native pollinators. And so I've just spoken to you for an hour about our native bees. And you might come away from this thinking that saving native bees is an enormous, overwhelming task. There's so much we know, but there's so many secrets that we have left to learn. And there's certainly a future in which we don't know these secrets, and that our planet is quieter and less full of bees. And if it's less full of bees, it's also less full of flowers, and it's also less full of fruits, and it's also less full of bee wolves and all the things that depend on bees as well. But we also know enough to act now. And this is sort of my call to action, which is we have to each take small, intentional, repeatable actions in order to address declines of native bees. We need to plant flowers throughout the year that are diverse in bloom time, but also size and shape and color. We need to tell the pesticide companies we're not interested in another application. We need to stop mowing our lawns as frequently, or partition part of our lawns into flowers. We also need to teach the next generation that bees need to be revered for their marvelous mystical life cycles and not feared. Most of our native bees don't sting and can't even sting you. And so we need to teach children and everybody that bees need to be revered. And so if we follow these steps and take these actions, there's a future in which our forests and wetlands and backyards and cities are again bee loud. And the bees I'm talking about are the red bees, the cuckoo bees, the blue bees, the mason bees, the green bees, these sweat bees, the slender sweat bees that are not green but black and so abundant, the chunky wool carder bees that go after that penstemon, and of course, my favorite, the adorable cellophane bees. It would not be a planet without them. And they are pure resilience hiding in plain sight. And if we only give them some attention and start to understand what they do and how they do it, we'll be able to sort of address their declines. And so thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Nick, we have a couple in the chat. I think you partially addressed one of these, but maybe if you have some specific recommendations. Steve is asking, if one has raspberry canes, what should we do to encourage these small carpenter bees to be able to live in them?
So if you have raspberry canes, they'll grow in a single year, and then you can cut them back to between 6 to 12 inches and leave them like that through the winter. And then the following year, you've left your 6 to 12 inch raspberry canes, leave them there. Don't take them down in spring. And that year, the carpenter bees will find them. You don't need anything else than just a freshly cut, long enough raspberry cane, and the Carpenter bees will find them. But also make sure that you leave those canes up for the full year, right? So they grew year one, you left them over the winter year, in that first winter. The bees nested in them year two, and now the bees have to spend a winter in them. So you can take them down 3 years, after they were produced. There's a question about soil temperatures. How do you know if it's warm enough for bees to emerge? So I don't recommend cutting down perennial stems in spring, right? So again, you have to think of the bee's life cycle. The plant grew stems in year one. Those stems don't have any bees in them because the plant was growing. Then those stems die and you leave them standing over the winter. Then the following year, those stems are standing, the bees will nest in those standing stems. You cannot cut them down that first year because the bees are nesting in them. Then those stems are standing, you leave them another winter, and then the bees will emerge from those standing stems. And so if you want to cut them down, the best time to cut them down is that fall, the fall after the year the bees nested in the stems. Because some of these bees that nest in stems emerge in spring, but many of them will emerge in late summer. Bill had a question about how do bees manage to fly so well and avoid drag if covered in hair? There's a whole quote like physicists are like bumblebees shouldn't be able to fly, but they do. Bees are expert flyers, and they maybe aren't as fast of flyers as hairless, more streamlined insects, but they're adapted to flying quite well. And in fact, bees can fly many, many kilometers to find flowers. There's a question about very early flowering perennials and ground covers to support bees. In fact, so the best way to support early spring bees are woody plants. So trees like maples, but also service berries and willow shrubs are really good. A low ground cover that's better in sort of sandy or drier soils is known as bearberry. Bearberry flowers in late April. But again, on our Tufts Pollinator Initiative website, we have all sorts of resources for you. Sohail had a question. We had a question from Consuelo. How many eggs with a cuckoo bee lay one per nest or invade? Okay, so every cuckoo bee will lay one egg per host cell. So if a cuckoo bee goes in, she'll lay just one egg often in that host cell. But she might lay like 5 eggs in 5 or 6 different nests. The most important thing for her is that she's able to gain access to that nest. So the nest has to be active. And Sohail had a question. The pesticide lobby is huge and powerful and wealthy. How do we organize against it and its allies in local, state, and national politics? It is a very daunting task. I'll just be frank, I don't have very much experience lobbying against pesticide companies. The way that I approach this is sort of don't partake in it on an individual level, right? So much of our land is privately held, and so much of it is homeowners applying to lawns. And so while agricultural pesticide use is a huge issue, I think the best way that we can take action against pesticide companies is simply refusing to apply it to our own yards. And through that, I think the best way is education. And there's a whole fad and a whole idea in sociology, which is, it's called social contagion, where you do what your neighbors do. So there's a tipping point where once enough of your neighbors are doing something or saying no to pesticide companies or planting gardens, then other neighbors will start to change their behavior because they want to be similar to what's around them. And so right now we're at this sort of very lawn-based state where everyone wants to have lawns, but we're trying to think about how can we change the whole dynamic of the system so that we're shifting it towards a state where more people want to have native plant gardens. Lindsay asked, what happens when a bee meets a butterfly? They share. A butterfly is a little dainty and they sort of hang on the edges of the flowers. But I don't know of any instances where a bee has an antagonistic relationship with a butterfly. If anything, like the butterfly just takes up so much space the bee can't land. But no, it's not a bee eat butterfly world out there. And Consuelo asked a question, do Andrina and Calides emerge in spring around the same time? Andrina being those mining bees that had different, there's a generalist and the specialists. Yeah, Andrina and Calides emerge at the same time. So Calides, the cellophane bees, they emerge early, but most Andrina are spring emerging. So there's about, hundreds of species of Andrina in New England, and they're all emerging around now. And they'll emerge and be active until the trees and the early spring ephemerals in the woodlands have finished flowering. And if you have photos, Consuelo, feel free to email them to Bee or the Tufts Pollinators group.
Great. I think you covered all the questions. Thank you so much for staying on and doing that, and
Of course.
for that fascinating talk. It was awesome.
Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. And yeah, feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. I'm more than happy to answer them.
Great. Have a good night, everyone.